Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar session. My name is Natalie Richardson. I'm Managing Director at Save Your Skin Foundation. I welcome you to today's webinar presentation titled About Biosimilars, What We Know and What We Want to Know. Before we get started, there are a few things I would like to mention. All participants in the audience for today's webinar will be in listen-only mode for the duration of the session. There will be a question and answer portion at the end of the presentation. You will see at the right-hand side of your screen an option to type in a question. Please feel free to ask your questions throughout the presentation, and we will do our best to answer them in the last segment. If there are any questions that do not get an immediate answer, we will contact you with a reply after the webinar. This session is being recorded, and it will be available for replay on the Save Your Skin Foundation website starting tomorrow. An email notification will be sent to everyone who registered with a link to the recording. At this time, I would like to introduce you to our valued panelists for this webinar about biosimilars. To begin, we have Cathy Parker, Director General of the Biologics and Genetic Therapies Directorate, the Health Canada, and Stephanie Hardy, Manager within the Office of Policy and International Collaboration, also a BGTD. This unit is responsible for biosimilars policy activities. The second portion of this presentation will be by Helen Mai, Policy and Strategy Advisor at CADTH'S, which is the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health. CADTH'S is an independent, not-for-profit organization responsible for providing Canada's healthcare decision-makers with objective evidence to help make informed decisions about the optimal use of drugs, medical devices, diagnostics, and procedures in our healthcare system. Thirdly, we have Louise Binder. Louise is a lawyer and health advocate who has been involved in informing the development of health policy and systemic treatment access practices from a patient perspective for more than 20 years. Louise is presently a health policy consultant with Save Your Skin Foundation. Thanks again for joining us. We will now begin the session. I hand this over to Louise to put into context the presentations following.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and thank you to all of my my illustrious presenters. I'm the unillustrious presenter on this one, but I also really want to thank all of you attendees. I see the numbers are going up, so obviously there are a lot of people interested in this topic. I want to be clear that although there certainly will hear some general information about biosimilars from our from all presenters, the focus here is really in oncology and the implications of biologics and biosimilars in oncology. So, and that it's important to emphasize that because there are other disease groups and areas where there may be other issues, but I really think we should just focus our thinking in this call on what does this all mean for oncology patients. And I think all of us know that biologics have become a very important part of the oncology treatment paradigm, and I think will continue to be even more so as time goes on, that once a biologic its patent life has expired, which is 17 years, till they change NAFTA. Sorry, that was a slight aside. Then a product which is being called a biosimilar can come onto the market in the same area that the biologic has, in the disease area that the biologic has been in. We will be defining those terms for you in a few minutes. So what we want to do here is let you know what we do know, let you know what we don't know, and let you know what we think it's important for oncology patients to know at this point. So with that, I turn it over to my colleagues at Health Canada.
Great, thank you very much. So it's Stephanie Hardy here. I'll just do a check-in to make sure you can all hear me okay.
Yep.
Okay, great. So thank you for that introduction, and it's great to be on this, and very timely for the oncology biosimilars that we expect to see coming on the market quite soon, I guess. So if on my slide number 2, there's just an overview of what I plan to talk about, a quick overview of what biologics are and what biosimilars are. some principles about how they're regulated by Health Canada, and I'll cover that as well by going into some of the frequently asked questions that we get about biosimilars and respond to them from the regulator's perspective. And then I thought to finish off, I would just touch on some of the key Health Canada activities that are ongoing or that are being planned related to biosimilars. So over to slide 3, what are biologics? What are biosimilars? For those that don't already know, I'll just do a brief overview. So biologic drugs, unlike chemically synthesized drugs, are basically derived from living organisms. So what does that mean? It means that they're large, structurally complex, difficult to characterize, and inherently more variable. So bottom line is they're very complex and expensive to manufacture. And what that means for us as a regulator is that there require differences in the way that they're regulated compared to the smaller molecules. So we do have strong regulatory oversight. And in the concept of biosimilars in 2016, 7 of the top 10 selling drugs, were biologics. So the appetite for an interest in biosimilars is definitely there. So moving on to what biosimilars are. So biosimilars are biologic drugs. So everything, all the characteristics that I just mentioned apply, but it's a biologic drug that is highly similar to one that is already authorized in Canada. And that throughout the presentation we'll refer to as reference biologic drug, or often the originator or innovator. So these can come onto the market, as Louise said, once the patent or protections for the innovator expire. So due to the characteristics we already identified, unlike generic products, producing identical biologics is not possible, hence the name biosimilar. And so I'll move into a bit on the next slide, just some of the principles of our regulatory framework and how they're regulated in Canada. So they are regulated as new drugs. So what does that mean? That means that all of the same legislation in our Food and Drugs Act and same requirements in our food and drug regulations apply, just like to any other biologic drug. So the same additional regulatory controls that we apply to biologics, for instance, our lot release program, good manufacturing practices, and all of our post-market surveillance activities also apply to biosimilars. So as part of our review, we really focus on assessing the quality, safety, and efficacy and the overall benefit-risk balance for the intended use of the product. So all of that also applies to biosimilars, the difference being that we regulate based on the concept of similarity. So the manufacturers would meet those regulatory requirements via a demonstration of similarity. And just to point out, just like any other drugs, when we're reviewing them, if we feel we don't have sufficient information to make a decision, we can request additional information. And there is an example of that in the case of biosimilars in a different disease area, in Flectra, where we did require additional information from the manufacturer for certain indications. So I'll move on to the next slide, and I thought I'd go through a bit more of the regulatory framework and oversight through this list of 5 questions and answering these 5 questions. So moving on to the first one, a lot of the time we get either questions or sometimes misunderstandings about how the development and subsequently the regulatory review processes for innovator products differ from biosimilars. So this slide is a bit busy, but really it's all to show that for the innovator, the bulk of the time, as you can see by the diagram, is spent generating data to support regulatory approval focused on the clinical studies. And that's because the sponsor has to independently demonstrate the safety and efficacy for each of the indications being sought. So in contrast, as you can see from the diagram for biosimilars, the emphasis there on the left is really placed on that demonstration of similarity, and the foundation of that program is at the analytical, the comparative studies at the analytical, or commonly referred to as the quality level. So if the manufacturer is able to achieve that demonstration of similarity, what it allows the biosimilar to leverage all of the prior information, so the clinical safety and efficacy information known about the reference. And another important point about the development process is it truly is a stepwise development process, going from those quality or analytical comparabilities all the way through non-clinical to clinical. So I'll move on to question 2. Why are traditional clinical studies not required in each indication? And this really builds on, I think, the previous question, where for the innovator product, the innovator has already established that efficacy and safety for each of the indications. So the Canadian regulatory approach, and we aren't alone, this is the international thinking or approach by other regulatory agencies as well, is that the biosimilar doesn't have to reestablish that benefit risk. So if the biosimilar has been established to be very similar in structure and function to the reference that already has the well-established safety and efficacy, the clinical studies don't need to be repeated in each of the indications. So with biosimilars, the purpose of the clinical program really in that stepwise fashion is to show that any uncertainty from the quality assessment wouldn't translate into clinically meaningful differences in efficacy, safety, or immunogenicity. And in these studies, we use what is referred to as the most sensitive population. The reason being we want to be able to identify or rule out any differences. So for biosimilars, they are eligible to apply for any of the indications that are authorized in Canada held by the reference. And we make our decisions on granting the indications or conditions on use based on, I'm sure you've heard it thrown around a lot, the totality of evidence. So we make that decision based on the demonstration of similarity, based on data obtained from all of the comparative analyses, as well as what is known about the reference. So the next one on slide 8, we get a lot. Are biosimilars as safe and effective as the originator? Short answer, yes. We do, given our robust regulatory framework, patients and healthcare providers can be confident that a biosimilar will work the same as its reference drug. So following our review and if we've given a notice of compliance, which is our authorization, you can be confident that the quality, safety, and efficacy are highly similar and that there are no clinically meaningful differences. So what does that mean? It means that we don't expect any differences. So we would expect the same response as would be seen in the innovator. Of course, as in any instance, not just with biosimilars and innovators, individual patients may always have a different response. So moving on to question 4, how do we align internationally? So for us, our response to that is we align, our principles are the same as the other leading regulator frameworks. And in fact, our framework, Europe was a leader in the biosimilars regulatory framework, and ours was modeled quite closely after the European framework. We also participated quite closely in the development of WHO guidelines for biosimilars as well. And along that same line, we participate and invest in several activities with other regulatory agencies with the purpose of promoting regulatory alignment and facilitating information sharing. So on the slide 9 there, you'll see a couple of the examples there. I've mentioned our work with the World Health Organization, or WHO, but another we participate in regularly are regular teleconferences between ourselves, the US FDA, the European Medicines Agency, and Japan on topics of mutual interest and biosimilar submissions. The other is a larger group, the International Pharmaceutical Regulators Program. So this is greater than 10 regulatory agencies, and we've actually just taken a co-chair role of this group, which we're excited about. And this one again focuses on, promoting regulatory alignment and information sharing. And just to show how much interest there is in this area, a new group is actually in the process of being formed between Canada, Australia, Singapore, and Switzerland. So there's a lot going on in the international field. Moving on to the next slide. So question 5 is another one we get a lot as well. What is our position on switching and interchangeability? So for us, our authorization, unlike on the generic side, our authorization is not a declaration of equivalence for the reasons given about biosimilars and the nature of biologic drugs. And in fact, that authority to declare products interchangeable is not with us, but rests with the provinces and territories. The same situation applies to Europe as well. So really the outlier a bit here is the US FDA, who recently came out with their legislative and regulatory framework with a separate pathway for with an interchangeable designation. So we are watching them very closely. To date, there aren't any products approved, but they have released a draft guidance document, which I believe they are finalizing right now on what they would expect to see for that as data requirements for that pathway. And I believe CADTH'S might be speaking a bit more in their presentation about switching. So from there, I'll move on to the next slide, and I thought I'd just go over a bit of some of our current activities and upcoming activities, the main one being Biologics naming. And I'm happy to announce just yesterday, you may have gotten notices, we launched a consultation to help inform the development of a Canadian biologics naming policy, and that's been done in collaboration with ISMP Canada, or the Institute for Safe Medication Practices. So I do encourage you to respond to the consultation. The link is also on our webpage as well, and feel free to forward that around to anyone else you think should respond. The other is continued activities for stakeholder outreach and education, so webinars such as these, but we're also looking at hosting a series of webinars on biosimilars as well. So we would welcome any comments or ideas related to that, and our contact information is on the next slide. Another area is capacity building and information sharing. So to respond to the increase in number of biosimilar submissions from a regulatory point of view, we are hiring new staff to respond. And we're also implementing tools to facilitate information sharing with our Canadian partners, such as CADTH'S, and really the purpose of those exercises are to for access, to promote faster access to products. So before I end off there, another piece that may be of interest is a group here recently went through and updated our summary basis of decision template for biosimilars. And the goal really was to improve how the information is presented and the format and flow of how the information is presented to better reflect the decision making for biosimilars. So any new biosimilars that are authorized will use that format, so you can look out for that. And I will sign off there. Thank you very much.
Okay, over to Helen.
Thanks, Louise. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to really take the opportunity to thank Save Your Skin Foundation for inviting us to speak about biosimilars, and to thank all participants in this webinar. So you've heard from Stephanie on how biosimilars are regulated in Canada. So for this section, our objectives are really to provide you with a brief overview of the Canadian public drug funding process, and really specific to hone in on the reimbursement pathway for biosimilars. We'll outline some of the key issues that are top of mind about biosimilars, and also highlight some of the potential upcoming biosimilars for cancer indications that could be coming to Canada. So in our next slide, we're looking at really drug access, who does what. So as many know, the drug approval process in Canada have several key steps. This would include biosimilars. So as you heard, before a drug can be sold in Canada, Health Canada must issue its approval through a notice of compliance. In terms of public funding, a new drug will be assessed by a health technology assessment body. And in Canada, we have CADTH'S, which is the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, and INES, which is the Institut National d'Excellence en Santé et en Services Sociaux in Quebec. So really the objectives of HTA is to make a recommendation and help decision makers to decide whether or not to fund a technology. So when we talk about HTA, we really look at evaluating the benefits and risks of the new treatment compared to existing treatment, and consider among the many key factors such as the efficacy, the safety, the burden of illness and need, as well as the impact of the side effects on patients' quality of life, as well as the impact on the healthcare system. We also look at cost effectiveness, and when we assess it, we are looking at things like whom does the drug work for and when? Is it better than what we already have? How will it be used? What are some of the trade-offs among many others? So as you know, we have two drug programs at CADTH'S. We have the Common Drug Review, or CDR, for non-cancer drugs, and the PanCanadian Oncology Drug Review for cancer drugs. So once a recommendation is issued through the HTA process, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance will support jurisdictions through joint negotiations to ensure that value for publicly funded drug programs. And of course, the final funding decision remains with each participating jurisdiction. So in the next slide, we wanted to sort of give you an overview of the key outputs from each of the steps for a biosimilar. As you can see, the output from Health Canada is the market authorization. With respect to CADTH'S, we will issue a report. The information would include the clinical and cost information, as well as input from stakeholders. pCPA will support the negotiations, and of course, the public payers will make the final decision. So in our next slide, we wanted to highlight some of our current process. So as you know, for biosimilars, we currently have a tailored review process at CADTH'S. And really in reflecting the international approach on the assessment of biosimilars, and given our experiences to date, we had issued a consultation to revise the biosimilars process for both CDR and PCODER. And the proposal is really to streamline the process, to be able to reduce the duplication of work, to look at optimizing resources, and help facilitate decision-making for biosimilars for all participating jurisdictions. We believe that really a streamlined approach for biosimilar reviews would support improved access for patients. So in the next slide, we wanted to provide you with some key highlights. So we had issued an update in December to notify that we will be releasing information about the biosimilars process in February. So I wanted to take this opportunity to provide you with some highlights of our proposed revised process. So with this revision, we anticipate seeing reduced timelines. In terms of the submission requirements, there will be fewer requirements, and we're looking at a new abbreviated submission review template that will include the key information about the biosimilar under review. We certainly believe that the insights, perspectives, and experiences from all stakeholders are integral to the process. So we want to ensure that stakeholders' perspectives and experiences with biosimilars are considered as part of this revised process. And of course, in keeping with our core values on transparency, the report will be posted on the CADTH'S website, similar to all of our drug reviews. So in terms of the next slide, we just wanted to give you some highlights on our experiences to date. So from this slide, you can see that we've looked at 6 biosimilars with the 7th one under review through the CDR process. In terms of the PCODER, we have not yet received any biosimilars for a cancer indication to date. So in our next slide, I think it's really where we get into the heart of the matter. So we wanted to highlight some of the key questions that we think would be of interest to you. So first, we'll touch on the concepts of switching, substitution, and interchangeability. We'll also delve into how studies are selected for a particular condition and illustrate an example of how authorization of indications work. We'll highlight some of the themes that we heard from patients about biosimilars through our CADTH'S reviews to date. And we'll consider as a group how biosimilars could benefit beyond cost savings. And finally, we hope to make the case that how biosimilars are reviewed from a regulatory and HTA perspective is really not unique to Canada. So I think just moving on to the next slide. When we speak about biosimilars, we often hear references to interchangeability, substitution, and switching. So we think it's important to highlight these key concepts. Decisions about interchangeability are made by provinces and territories. This means that if a drug is deemed to be interchangeable, then a pharmacist can dispense a drug without having to notify a prescriber. Substitution means the act of dispensing one product in place of another. So substitution could be automatic substitution or therapeutic substitution. Automatic substitution usually occurs when a drug product is deemed interchangeable. So as noted, this means that the pharmacist may dispense a drug product by following the policy direction and using their professional judgment. As many know, to date, no Canadian public drug programs have deemed biosimilars that are funded as interchangeable. Now, in terms of therapeutic substitution, this really means a replacement with a different medication from the same class that's expected to have the same therapeutic effect. So really, decisions to make a therapeutic substitution are generally made by pharmacists based on a medical directive, either from a pharmacy and therapeutics committee of a hospital or from an individual physician. So therapeutic substitution, in a way, is really looking at switching. So switching is really a decision to change a specific patient's medication. Decisions about switching are generally made by individual patients and their prescribers, really based on the available clinical evidence. As you've heard, Health Canada has provided guidance on switching, where it generally refers to a one-time change from a reference biologic to a biosimilar. But I think what's important to remember is that besides changing from a reference biologic drug to the biosimilar, switching from one drug to another is really not new. We know that switching is often performed to control disease activity and can be necessary in different clinical settings, and in particular in the oncology space. So we've seen, for example, that in the US and in Europe, with the benefit of the earlier patent expiration at their end, they have a bit more experience with some of the biosimilars. We're seeing more switching studies certainly being conducted, including those in oncology. An example was recently presented at ASCO and published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology on the safety and efficacy of alternating treatment with a filgrastim biosimilar and its reference products. And in that publication, the authors reported that there was no difference in efficacy, safety, or immunogenicity when switching from a reference to a biosimilar, or vice versa, for the prevention of myelosuppressive chemotherapy-induced neutropenia. So what I think we're going to see is that we'll likely see more of these studies in the near future. So in terms of moving on to the next question, is that another key question is how are studies selected for a particular condition? We heard from Stephanie earlier that biosimilar may be approved, certainly, I think, for more conditions of use which its reference product is licensed. I think it's important to note that these authorization of indications are based on the extrapolation of the totality of data obtained with the biosimilar in direct comparison to the reference product. And since a biosimilar is similar in structure and function to a reference biologic drug with well-established safety and efficacy, in many cases, we've seen that clinical studies are not required for all approved indications. And certainly we know that every indication for which authorization is sought must be scientifically justified. So in the next slide, we have included an example with infliximab, where Health Canada granted authorization of indications of the data from the rheumatoid arthritis and ankylosing spondylitis initially to plaque psoriasis, psoriatic arthritis, and then added approvals in the Crohn's disease, the fistulizing Crohn's, and as well as the ulcerative colitis, based on similarity between the biosimilar and the originator product in terms of looking at their quality, their mechanism of action, the disease pathophysiology, the safety profile, and certainly on the clinical experience with the reference drug. I think really what's important here is that approval of an additional indication through scientifically valid extrapolation really helps to expedite the development of biosimilars and eliminates the unnecessary clinical studies, thereby increasing patient access to important therapies. So in terms of our next slide, we wanted to really highlight some of the key themes that we've heard from patients on biosimilars. And we know that an essential part of CADTH'S drug review process is really founded on the principles of representation and collaboration. So the process enables stakeholders to provide input into the review. And based on the 6 biosimilar reviews to date, we heard the key themes from the patient input include access and cost, whether it's safe and efficacious. Some have commented around the regulatory process, in particular comments around the surveillance. So for example, where the drug product may have the same non-proprietary name. And we've heard from Stephanie earlier that this is really now being considered through the consultation. We've also certainly heard switching is certainly a concern if the patient has not consented, as well as around the availability of patient support programs. So these are really the key themes that we've heard and are certainly shared with the decision makers. So in our next slide, we wanted to sort of highlight, are biosimilars really about cost savings? And as you know, as part of Health Canada's review, cost and affordability is not part of that mandate. From an HTA perspective, we certainly see a rapid increase in healthcare costs and the limited budgets that the drug programs and cancer agencies have to work with. And so in cost savings, it's certainly an important consideration. And based on a comparison of the transparent list price, we see the potential discounts with the biosimilars that are listed. However, I think cost savings is not the only benefit. We also see, for example, the growth of the biosimilars market may provide greater and earlier patient access to these important treatment options. These therapies, I think, really have the potential to improve the patient access as a result of some of the reduced financial and administrative barriers. So in the next slide, we wanted to provide a bit of some examples of the international HTA reviews of biosimilars. As we heard, Health Canada works collaboratively with other regulatory bodies. From an HTA perspective, we see alignment with how biosimilars are streamlined in Canada and certainly internationally. As an example, in the UK, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE, will review biosimilars as part of a multiple technology appraisal, and certainly biosimilars will not be considered in a single technology appraisal separate from the reference product. Another example, in Australia, biosimilars are considered as minor submissions by the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, and certainly minor submissions are generally much leaner than the regular because, for example, an economic model is actually not necessary to support the claims that are required in the submission. So in this last slide, we wanted just to really highlight some of the potential biosimilars for cancer indications that could soon be available in Canada. And this list is really simply a snapshot of the potential indications that could be coming in for us. So with that, I'll stop, and I'd really like to take this opportunity to thank you. So I'll pass the baton on to Louise.
Thank you. I think we've had some really important and interesting information provided, and what I'm going to try to do to the best of my ability is to do a little recap of what we've heard from each of the panelists so far from the lens of, so what does it mean to the patient, or what are some of the things we might want to be thinking about as patients based on the information that we've heard. So let's start with the information from Health Canada. So Health Canada has told us that safety and efficacy of products with originator or reference biologics, these are all heard, are very important, that these are complex products to manufacture, and therefore they are more expensive to manufacture, which obviously is going to impact price, which is a very important thing for patients, both in terms of whether they're paying for those products or whether they're likely to see them paid for by other payers, and particularly public payers. But at least we can understand that there probably is some reason to accept that this is a more complex process and for manufacture, and it's undoubtedly more expensive than manufacturing a small molecule. The other thing that was very interesting to me in learning about biologics is that apparently even from one batch of a reference or originator biologic to another, the products will not be absolutely the same because of the fact that biologics are being created from living cells. And apparently a lot of things impact the manufacture. Such things, I've been in presentations where they've talked about the temperature in the room where it's being manufactured, the water temperature, all kinds of factors impact the manufacture. So I think it's important to just understand that this is quite a different kind of product than small molecules. So moving from the originator biologics to the biosimilars, we're hearing from Health Canada that biosimilars are biologics. They're similar to the reference originator biologic, but not identical, that they're legally permitted for sale after the patent has expired. The innovative clinical research to create the product is not required. The researcher doesn't have to provide that to the biosimilar company, and obviously good manufacturing practices are required. So we can see that where biosimilars should be saving us money is in the fact that they didn't have to do the original research to develop this biologic. It's been done, but they still do have a profound amount of work to do in terms of the manufacture, and it is complex. But certainly because they don't have the upfront work and some of the work afterwards, after the product has been created, that the original manufacturer does, that's where the savings are. And I would argue that we want to look very carefully as patients that we are really getting the most for our money in these biosimilars, because they are going to be used and they are a way of getting headroom in our drug budget. So we certainly want to make sure that we're getting as much as we can. So Health Canada has mentioned a couple of things that I think are important. Maybe we could go to the next slide. Health Canada has made it clear that they're doing a very robust safety and efficacy analysis of these products. And so I think it's certainly safe to say that given the information available in the trials, that Health Canada is giving us a safe and effective product when it approves this product. I personally feel quite confident about that. One of the things that we do need to keep in mind, of course, and this is true not just for biologics research, but for biosimilars research, but for biologics research, and in fact for research of all kinds, is that clinical trials are time limited, and clinical trials certainly only have certain populations of people in them. So I think one of the things, and maybe Stephanie can comment about this later, I think no matter whether it's a biologic, a biosimilar, we really want real world evidence after the trial data are available to see what happens in the longer term for people who are in those trials, and also to look at other populations that may receive these treatments, these biologics or biosimilars, after the outside of the trial population, because they may have lots of other confounding factors, comorbidities, other treatments they're taking, all kinds of other things that may impact how well they do with any particular drug or any particular biologic, whether it's a reference biologic or a biosimilar. So I think that's a really important aspect that maybe we need to really keep our eye on as patients. On the next slide, we talk a little bit about, so I think we've talked about this one, and we can probably go to the next slide if we could. So, and we've talked a little bit about this as well. So we've talked about, at least I've talked about the fact that my analysis, my understanding of what I've heard is that biologics are very robustly reviewed by Health Canada, as are biosimilars. But of course, over time, because biologics are proteins, I'm given to understand that there is a certain immune response that continues that's called immunogenicity. And apparently, this immune response may change over time, potentially making a biologic or a biosimilar less effective. And this, of course, is something important for patients, because it means that we want our doctors monitoring very carefully our treatment over time, and continue to have ongoing discussions about that original treatment as appropriate ongoing for us. So that's another big issue, I think, for patients. And it's not a reflection of the safety and efficacy of the product. I want to be clear about that. It's just a fact that is as a result of the fact that we're dealing with proteins. So on the next slide, I think another important question. So we talked about, are these things safe and effective as a first line therapy? By first line, I mean the first therapy that you take to deal with a particular disease. Then the question, of course, and we've heard a little bit about this as well, is what about starting with a biologic and moving to a biosimilar in some fashion? So so Health Canada's been clear that it does not deem a biologic and a biosimilar as interchangeable. Okay, that's not so as Helen has said, that's really a question that is being dealt with at the provincial level, and it's not something that Health Canada is determining. So on the next slide, we'll look at some of the other terms. So we've heard about automatic substitution. keep trying to understand these terms, and I have to tell you that they continue to confound me, but I do my best. So automatic substitution is a situation where a prescriber prescribes one treatment and a pharmacist filling the prescription changes it for another equivalent drug based on his or her professional judgment and payer reimbursement. And that's a product in the same category. I think that was Helen. Helen was very clear about that. So in all cases, the patient obviously must be informed and agree to the automatic, to this substitution. However, in terms of payment, if the reimburser is only willing to pay for the substituted product, it may well be that the patient is going to have to pay if they want to remain on the original treatment that the prescriber prescribed. So that's something that patients are going to have to look at very carefully. So what about the other definitions that we hear? Switching is something that we hear a lot about. And so far, we're not in a situation where, as Helen has said, we have any trial results about switching in oncology. So for the moment, we're in a wait and see mode. But what does it mean to switch? So it's a form of substitution, and it occurs when a patient on a biologic treatment is switched during that treatment to a biosimilar by a prescriber, that is a physician. And this may happen moving from an originator biologic to a biosimilar if the physician believes that it's worthwhile for the patient and with the patient's consent. But this can't be done merely by the pharmacist. And of course, the patient has to agree. As I've said, for the moment, I think this is not a question which has been answered yet in oncology, because as to whether that is possible to do, because the trials are still ongoing. So I think if we turn to the next slides, you'll see that really, so for the moment, my conclusion about all of this is that what we need to be focusing on in the short term in oncology is whether, as these new products that Helen has mentioned come to the health technology assessment group in the biosimilars field in oncology, are we satisfied and comfortable that they are safe and effective, recognizing that they are not exactly the same and cannot be the same, and also, of course, recognizing that we need to be monitored over time because things do change as a result of these products being proteins and actually the immune system responding to them differently, potentially over time. So that's really, I think, the big issues for us at the moment in oncology. So we know, as I mentioned, that biologics are costly to manufacture. We want access to our treatments. I mean, bottom line for patients, we want access, we want it in a timely fashion, and of course we want it to safe and effective products. So biologics are definitely more costly to manufacture than small molecule drugs, small molecules or drugs. The prices for them make it more difficult for the public and even private reimbursers to afford to include them for coverage. And that's not a comment about whether the price is right or wrong or anything else. I'm not commenting on that, but they are pricey. And therefore, in a limited drug budget situation, you have to expect that the reimbursers, and I expect that the reimbursers are going to want to save as much money as they can in their budget by reimbursing for biosimilars rather than biologics, all other things being equal. And I think we should expect that that's what's going to happen. So it does appear that all other factors being equal, safety, efficacy, adherence factors, taking a biosimilar as a first-line therapy rather than a biologic certainly will save money in the drug budget. But I would argue that, and I personally don't object to that kind of switch or that kind of decision. It's not a switch, that kind of decision. But I would argue that we should be allowed to retain those savings in the drug budget. And in fact, I'd like to see it in the oncology portion of the drug budget, because we have a lot of other very expensive oncology drugs that are coming down the pipe that are going to be very important. And I'm not saying they're, you know, and again, it's not an editorialization about whether the price will be right or wrong, but certainly we're going to need those products, CAR-T therapies, other immunotherapies, and if we can indeed, in a safe and effective way, save some money through biosimilars, I certainly want to see that money stay with us for use for other products that we're going to need in oncology. So on the next slide, so that's kind of all of that. Now, Health Canada, before we go on to the naming, Health Canada did mention, Stephanie did mention, that Health Canada is looking to do education sessions about biologics and biosimilars. I think that's really wonderful, and I really applaud them for that. And I know that Stephanie did give us all on this call the invitation to give suggestions to Health Canada about what to do in that regard. And so please take her up on that. And if you're not sure how to reach her, we can certainly help you do that. Naming, the main thing, the main issue for naming is obviously if names aren't different, then there can be safety issues as a result of that. It's hard to follow the product after it's on the market when names are the same. And I was really pleased to hear that there is a consultation at Health Canada about naming. And please, again, feel free. In fact, I would encourage you to respond to that consultation. Let Health Canada know what you think ought to be the policy in Canada for naming. So moving on to the next slide. So there's our summary. I don't have to go through it all now. I don't want to, because I want to leave some time for you to ask questions, but these slides are available. And I certainly think that it's an exciting time for us in oncology, that biosimilars are a very interesting product for us to be looking at and considering. And certainly we hope that Health Canada will do a stellar job on real world evidence, as it's doing in reviewing these products for approval. And that I know we can rely also on CADTH'S to take a very, through PCODER, to take a very close look at the value of these products and make recommendations to the provinces that are good for patients. So that's it. Down to questions. Natalie, are you going to manage the questions for us?
Yes, I would be happy to. We have a few questions. I do have one. We have a couple minutes for questions. We have a couple minutes left. I have one for Helen. How will biosimilars that have both an oncology and non-oncology indication be assessed by CADTH'S?
Thanks, Natalie. That's a really good question. So in terms of biosimilars, they will follow the same process as we have currently for all drug products. So for currently how we manage is that for non-cancer indication, it would go through the CDR process, so the submissions, and then for the cancer, it will go through the PCODER process.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'll just remind any listeners, if you have any other questions, please feel free to type them in. It's been a very educational session for sure. Anyone has any other questions?
Stephanie, maybe you could, is there another question? Sorry.
No, I was just going to indicate that there's a handout with this as well that will be attached, and it looks like this. It puts some helpful biosimilar resources. So let me just go back up here and, pardon me, just. One more question here. What are your positions on non-medical switches? I'm not sure if that's been covered in the content already. What are your positions on non-medical switches?
Helen, do you have a comment about that?
So I think, again, it's really, when we're looking at switching, right, it goes down to looking at it from decision that's really decisions made by the patient and the prescriber on the available clinical evidence, right? But I think in terms of when you're looking at it from non-medical switching, I think I mentioned earlier, we're seeing a number of studies right now that are coming out where we're seeing that there is really no differences between the biologic and the biosimilars in terms of the efficacy, safety, and immunogenicity. So I think this is really going to be where we're seeing more and more evidence. Those decisions will be made by the drug programs.
Helen, for the moment,
I don't know if you, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask you a question about this. For the moment, my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I certainly could be, is that for the most part, treatments in cancer at this stage are fundamentally kind of acute, time-limited treatments. So am I right about that? And does that impact the question of, I mean, I wouldn't think that there would be much switching in that kind of scenario.
Right. So it really depends on the condition, right, and the indication and the care. So I don't think I can speak on specific indications, but I think in a number of cases where I think I've alluded earlier, where switching is not really new, right, in terms of the cancer space, where we do see patients switching from different therapies as they're going through to manage their disease state.
Okay. Thanks. Stephanie, did you want to say anything about switching?
I think Helen addressed it quite well. I think we've really only made some public statements about it in presentations and the fact sheet on our website because we're asked the question so often. But I think when we issue our NOC, we're confident that it'll have the same clinical outcome as the reference product. So really it is, I guess we just differentiate between a one-time switch or a well-controlled switch versus the switching back and forth repeatedly. So I think, as you said, in most of the oncology setting, that wouldn't be necessarily the case. And that really is just something you discuss with your practicing physician.
Okay, thank you. Stephanie, would you want to comment about real-world evidence?
I guess, I mean, here terminology matters a bit. I think in the way that you were speaking about it earlier, I couldn't agree more, not just in the biosimilar setting, but in all settings of that any clinical studies really were looking at the efficacy. But once it gets out into that real world use with humans and different medications and different factors, that effectiveness question comes into play. So I think that's one of the main reasons we have a life cycle approach to regulation and the post-market surveillance and the adverse event reporting and all of those other activities that we have in place to monitor any changes once it gets out into the real world, so to say.
Thank you.
Thank you. We do have time for one more quick question. What policies would you consider for a sustainable biosimilar market? For example, gain sharing if switching. I can repeat the question if you like. What policies would you consider for a sustainable biosimilar market? If anyone has an answer to that.
Well, it's Louise. I certainly don't have an answer, but I'm guessing that kind of behind that question is something that we keep hearing, which is that there hasn't been a lot of a really strong, robust uptake for some of the biologics, a number of the biologics that are already available, and a concern that you know, that the biologics industry won't continue and in fact grow without appropriate market share. It's kind of logical. To me, I guess the only answer I would say to that is I'm delighted, as I said before, that Health Canada is going to do education, because I'm suspecting that part of the issue may be a lack of understanding by people about what biosimilars are and aren't, and you know, what sort of the science of them and the sort of the health implications about them. And I might be wrong about that, but that's kind of an instinct I have. I don't know, Helen or Stephanie?
Yeah, Louise, it's Helen here, and I think I would concur with you on that, because I think a lot of times right now in Canada, biosimilars is still quite new to us, right? We've only, at least at CADTH'S, have seen at least 6, and then with the 7th one under review. Whereas we know in the European market, they've had biosimilars for a number of years now, right? So I think in terms of with time, experience, and understanding, I think eventually these will no longer be an issue. But I think to your point, it is really the education component that will be important.
Thanks.
Stephanie, I think we would agree with that as well, which is why we're undertaking some of these future webinars.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, with that, I will conclude the question period at this point. We're pretty much to the end of our time as well. If anyone has any further questions or thinks of something afterward, feel free to email, and we'll direct your questions appropriately and try to get them answered for you. Once again, thank you so very much to our panelists for your engaging discussion and insight today. And thank you to everyone who attended the session. As a reminder, this presentation will be available online at saveyourskin.ca starting tomorrow. And with that, that's everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.